Welcome to the Safety and Security Training for Intellectual and Developmental Disability Providers. Brought to you by the Rape Crisis Center of Coastal Horizon Center Incorporated and the North Carolina Council on Developmental Disabilities. This training was produced by the Rape Crisis Center of Coastal Horizon Center Incorporated and funded by the North Carolina Council on Developmental Disabilities. The purpose of this production was to enhance disability providers' capacity to serve survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence, and for sexual assault and domestic violence service providers to enhance their services for individuals with disabilities. The NCCDD owns the rights to this production. Sexual Violence 101. Before we get started, the most important thing to remember about sexual violence is that it's about power, not sex. It includes any type of sexual conduct or contact that is non-consensual. These definitions are not legal definitions. This is how the Rape Crisis Center and the majority of those in the domestic violence and sexual assault world define and agree upon the definitions of these terms. So these are not necessarily legal, but for the purpose of this training and typically your work forward. So rape as defined as non-consensual oral, anal, or vaginal penetration. It is by force and not just physical. We hear about or we think about maybe, she was tied down and he assaulted her. Well, no, that would be physical force, but there's also verbal threats saying, if you don't do this sexual act, I'll hurt your pets, or I'll hurt you, or I'll hurt your mother. Intimidation, threatening to use a weapon against someone, or saying, if you don't do this, I will withhold your paycheck, or something like that. Also coercion, right? So asking someone over and over and over again until they finally feel like they don't have a choice. Some risk factors are differential power relationships, like parent-child, doctor-patient, coach-student, etc. Anytime that there's that big differential in power, you kind of have a risk for sexual violence because you have the risk of someone taking advantage of someone who is perceived as more vulnerable than them. This also includes your non-contact offenses, such as obscene phone calls, texts, stalking, use in pornography, genital exposure, peeping, anything that would be sexual and non-consensual, meaning the receiving party does not want any part of this, would be considered sexual violence. So again, this is not a legal definition, but there are many types of sexual violence. So there's your acquaintance rape, which is what we have in the past called date rape. We don't really use that term because it sounds like rape light, right? And it's still an assault. So acquaintance rape is by far the most common type of assault. That is when the perpetrator and the victim are usually on a first name basis. They know each other. It's a boyfriend or a girlfriend, guy you went to school with. And for the purpose of this training, oftentimes we use the pronoun he for perpetrator, and victim, we use the pronoun she. That is not to say that men cannot be victims, because they absolutely can be. And that also is not to say that women cannot be perpetrators, because they absolutely can be. But statistically, women are more at risk for sexual violence, and statistically, men are typically the people that perpetrate these crimes. So that's just for the sake of time. I just use he and she instead of using every pronoun possible in order to make the point. So sexual harassment. So that's, you hear about at work. Your HR department's going to talk about inappropriate touching. But yeah, so that is making sexual jokes that make people uncomfortable, touching someone in a way that makes them feel uncomfortable. That's sexual harassment. Showing them pictures that are sexual in nature that they don't want to see, sexual harassment. Stranger rape. That's kind of what we see a lot on, in the news or on TV shows like Law and Order, where it's someone you literally do not know, kind of jumping out of the bushes, grabbing you and assaulting you. It's not to say that that doesn't happen. It does happen, but nowhere near as frequently as acquaintance rape. We also have drug and alcohol facilitated assaults. contrary to popular belief, alcohol is actually the #1 drug utilized to assault people because alcohol is really readily available. It's easy to get. It's easy to go to a bar and someone buys you a drink and then they buy you another drink. Then they buy you another drink and they keep saying, oh, come on, have this drink. Before you know it, you are totally inebriated and that person's carrying you out of the bar and everybody says, oh, that girl's such a slob and look at that nice guy. He's carrying her out of the bar and taking her home. She's such a mess. Well, really, is she a mess? I mean, is she really capable of consenting and knowing what's going on? Who knows? And then drug-facilitated assaults, that's you hear about, your roofies or your GHB putting into someone's drink. That's not as common just because, if you're going to buy a type of drug that is commonly used in assaulting people, that means somebody else knows you're about to do something illegal, which doesn't make you the smartest criminal, right? So typically those are not what we see. Child sexual abuse, pretty self-explanatory. Incest, which is much more common than people probably think. Familial generational violence is very common in the world of sexual violence. Again, because we talked about those power differentials, parent-child, grandparent-child, grandchild. Those are the people that have perceived authority above you, so you're going to kind of do whatever they say, even if their intentions aren't good. Intimate partner sexual assault. It's very common within domestic violence relationships for there to be a sexual assault component. And then statutory rape. That is when someone is significantly older than someone else and there is rape or sexual contact involved. And maybe the minor believes that it's consensual or feels that it's consensual, but is it really? Does that older person really have the, is this really a consensual relationship? Sexual abuse definition. So again, not a legal definition, just sort of the accepted definitions within this kind of realm of the world. So sexual abuse can include fondling, genital exposure, forced masturbation, oral, penile, or digital penetration of the mouth, vagina, or anus, and child prostitution or pornography. These are things that we see commonly and frequently within our realm of work, so it's just good to know about the different types. So here's some national statistics for just the general population, right? So the national statistics are that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men are sexually assaulted. As we discussed before, 90%, the vast majority of victims are female. 78.7% of female victims of sexual assault experience their first assault before the age of 25. 40.4% experience their first assault before the age of 18. And 73% of sexual assaults are committed by someone known to the victim. That acquaintance rape, right? So 38, and of that 73% within this study found that 38% are friends or acquaintances, 28% are intimate partners, and 7% are relatives. Arguably, however, these numbers are probably higher because you are way less, while you are more likely to be assaulted by someone that you know, you are way less likely to report an assault of someone that you know, if the perpetrator is someone that you know, right? So that's just something to be mindful of when you're looking at these statistics. Child sexual abuse. When we're looking at child sexual abuse, we're talking about any sexual act between an adult and a minor, or between 2 minors when one exerts power over the other. So sometimes we see, typically when people think about child sexual abuse, they think about, an older person sexually abusing a child, right? But it's also possible for a child to sexually abuse another child. That can look like a lot of different things. Typically, it's like a forcing or coercing or persuading a child to engage in any type of sexual act, but there's also those non-contact acts, right? Like exhibitionism, exposing a child to pornography, showing them these images and saying, okay, this is what I want you to do, or, oh, this is normal, this is, what we're going to do, kind of grooming them. Voyeurism, watching them change, or taking pictures of them while they're in the shower, stuff like that. communicating in a sexual manner by phone or internet, text, those types of things. Statistic-wise, 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 20 boys is a victim of child sexual abuse. Self-report studies show that 20% of adult females and 5 to 10% of adult males recall a childhood sexual assault or sexual abuse incident. Keep in mind that's a self-report study, meaning that people are, willingly come forward. So that number sounds, kind of high, but it's actually probably way higher than that. But people are, way less likely to, this is the least likely reported crime that there is. During a 1-year period in the U.S., 16% of youth ages 14 to 17 have been sexually victimized. Over the course of their lifetime, 28% of U.S. youths ages 14 to 17 have been sexually victimized. Children are most vulnerable to CSA, child sexual abuse, between the ages of 7 and 13. So you can see how big the impact is. So when we're talking about child sexual abuse, I feel like a lot of times the media will say things, I know on Law and Order they'll say, oh, when the little kid had injuries consistent with sexual violence. Actually, it is very unlikely that there will be any type of genital injuries after a child reports sexual abuse due to the nature of the genital area, due to the nature of sexual abuse. While it is a violent act, it's typically not, anything that would inflict injury. So just because a child doesn't have an injury doesn't mean that they're making it up, right? Children who experience rape or attempted rape in their adolescent years are 13.7 times more likely to experience rape or attempted rape in their first year of college. So when we're thinking about, oh, this is terrible, this happened to a child, we need to think long term about the effects of this. And the effects are, maybe this person, as a result of their assault, doesn't really know about healthy relationships or healthy boundaries, and as a result is more likely to be victimized when they're older, especially in your first year of college, which is actually one of the most dangerous times, most vulnerable times for women in terms of sexual assault. So again, more statistics for the general population. This is about reporting. So sexual assault is the most underreported crime. It is also the crime that is the most difficult to prosecute. So out of every assault that happens, only 60%, only 40% are ever reported. So 60%, over half, are never reported to the police. Males are the least likely to report a sexual assault, even though they make up 10% of all victims, right? So they probably make up more than 10%. And there are so many reasons why victims don't report. They're scared they won't be believed. They're scared they may be judged. They may blame themselves. They may think, oh, why did I, go on a date with that guy? Or why did I drink so much? Or why did I wear that? They want to figure out why this happened to them, and sometimes the easiest person to blame is yourself. Maybe they've had a previous experience with law enforcement that was not exactly positive. Sex workers, for example. Sex workers, it's likely that they have had encounters with law enforcement, and probably they weren't the most positive. So are you going to want to go to people who in the past you have had negative experiences with to tell them something so personal? Probably not. Male survivors. So in the U.S., about 10% of all victims are males. Researchers estimate that 1 in 6 men have experienced unwanted or abusive sexual experiences before age 18. Which is interesting and really further addresses the fact that this is so underreported with men, because 1 in 6 is way more than 10%, right? But they're just way less likely to report for a lot of reasons. Male survivors have concerns when seeking support for sexual assault that are the same as any other survivor, but then their trauma is further compounded and their barriers are further compounded just for being men. And then when you break it down even further into heterosexual males and homosexual males, you then have an entire scope of compounded barriers when addressing this trauma. So as far as heterosexual males, they may post-assault They may experience a fear that the assault will make them gay. They may feel that the assault has made them less of a man. They may feel that men cannot be assaulted. They may feel that somehow this was their fault. Maybe they sent out the wrong message to somebody because because the way our society talks about and addresses men is that men are tough and strong, and that doesn't happen to men. But the fact is, we know that it does. Then conversely, when you're talking about homosexual males, they may feel that the crime is punishment for their sexual orientation. And, the fact of the matter is, it may be. They may have been targeted because they were gay. It may have been a hate crime, which doesn't really make sense, right? But it's possible. They may worry that the assault affected their sexual orientation. So, for example, maybe a boy was sexually abused in childhood and he grew up and he's gay, and he wonders, is it possible that being sexually abused as a child when I was a little boy now made me gay? When really we know that's not possible, right? Again, they may fear that they were targeted because they are gay. This may cause them to withdraw from the community. Maybe they're always wandering around nervous, oh my gosh, am I going to be targeted again and be assaulted again because I'm gay? And then they may develop, self-loathing related to their sexual orientation. This wouldn't have happened if I was gay. If I hadn't been gay, then I wouldn't have been at that place, and I wouldn't have known that person. And so now they're hating a piece of them, which essentially is hating themselves. So male survivors really have a lot of the same issues, as we said before, as any survivor. But you really have to be mindful that they have a whole compounded set of issues that most people really don't address when we're talking about sexual abuse. Now we're going to get more specifically into individuals with disabilities. So in North Carolina specifically, a person with a disability is 5 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than someone without a disability. So previously we talked about the general population, and it was 1 in 4 women. So times that by 5. That's how common it is for women with disabilities to be abused. That is staggering. Another staggering number is that 90% of people with developmental disabilities will be physically or sexually abused. 90%. Half of people with developmental disabilities who are abused will experience 10 or more abusive incidents. And abusers will typically abuse as many as 70 people before getting caught, if they are ever caught. Sexual violence in individuals with disabilities. One study found that only 3% of sexual abuse cases involving people with developmental disabilities were reported to law enforcement. Now, only 40% of sexual assaults in the general population are ever reported. So that's a huge differential. People with disabilities experience abuse by a greater number of perpetrators in contrast with the just general population. They stay in dangerous situations significantly longer in both situations of physical and sexual abuse, almost double the time. And there's a multitude of reasons for this, which we'll get into a little bit later. But while we're talking about the subject of sexual violence in people with disabilities, it is super important to remember that it's not the actual disability that increases the risk for sexual victimization. It's societal and situational factors. It's the way society views people with disabilities. It's the way our society views disability as a bad thing that causes someone to be weak or not able to fend for themselves and maybe just not as human as everyone else, right? So that makes them easier to be victimized because of the way people view them. So during this presentation, we're going to be using what's called person-first language. So a great example of that is saying individual with a disability or person with a disability versus disabled person. Do you see the difference? So basically, disabilities are not people and they do not define people, right? So most people will tell you, like, yes, maybe my disability is the first thing that you see about me, but it's probably not the most interesting thing about me. Don't replace person nouns with disability nouns. The person is a person first, hence person first language. So it's just really important to be mindful of that. Language is a very important tool, and it's a very powerful tool in shaping the way that we think about people and groups of people. So it's just good to be mindful. So some more example of that. So for example, you don't say wheelchair bound, okay? You say person who uses a wheelchair, right? Because they're a person first. You don't say, oh, she's a schizophrenic. No, she's a person and she has schizophrenia. It's just one of the many pieces of her. Retarded. We don't say retarded ever, period. Retarded is extremely offensive, bordering on being a slur. You would just say person who has an intellectual or developmental or cognitive disability. But the American Medical Association still uses MR, mentally retarded, so it's not uncommon to see that, but it's just not nice to use. So again, like we talked about, it's really important to remember that it's not the disability that increases the risk factors. It's the societal and situational factors. So when we're looking at those factors, what are those factors? So first of all, from birth, our society really, really accepts that people with disabilities are supposed to be compliant, they obey the rules and those in charge, that they shouldn't get assertive or angry. They should always agree with adults or authority figures, and they should honor other people's opinions even above their own. They should always be obedient and dependent, because, you know, for example, let's say in a group home situation, if someone decides to express a negative feeling or a desire for change, and they don't have the words to say, no, I don't, want to do that, or even if they do have the words, people may think, oh, well, she doesn't know what she's talking about. That's just a behavior. And so consequently, as a result, they may punish that person or take something away or whatever, whatever it may be, because they're viewing that as a behavior, where someone without a disability, you would probably just honor what that person says and says, oh, well, she says no. So as a result, they don't express negative feelings or desire for change. Oftentimes they don't have, options to make personal choices. And refusal is typically, not accepted. They kind of have to go along to get along, because otherwise they may get in trouble or have consequences that are pretty dire. So why are they so vulnerable if it's not their disability? Okay, social isolation. People with disabilities are socially isolated. Maybe they have a lack of accessible transportation, whether that's, maybe they don't have a car that they can wheel their wheelchair into. Maybe they don't live on a bus line. Maybe they rely on others for care, other people to come to them. So they're not able to go out into the community and advocate for themselves. They're relying on other people to communicate for them. They may have communication barriers, right? If you are deaf and you communicate via ASL and you go somewhere where nobody can sign, you're kind of, out of luck there, right? How are you supposed to tell people good things or bad things? Poverty. People with disabilities are way more at risk for poverty. They are not given information about their bodies, and they're not given privacy. So they're not really ever taught, like, this is the difference between a public behavior and a private behavior. So how are you to know what's the difference? What's appropriate and what's not? Lack of knowledge about healthy, intimate relationships. In our schools, for just the on-level kids, we barely teach them any kind of sex ed, right? In the contained classrooms with kids with disabilities, they're getting nothing. There may be a lack of resources in the community for people with disabilities, or the person with a disability, due to social isolation, may not even be aware of the existing resources. They may not have support from their caregivers, who are very pivotal people in getting their day-to-day tasks done. And they may, be perceived as not as credible when disclosing sexual victimization. People without disabilities struggle to have people believe them, but then when you compound that with a disability, people are way less likely to believe that anything is going wrong. Again, why are individuals with disabilities vulnerable to sexual assault? A big piece of this is the lack of sex education. They do not receive sex ed in the schools, especially, which is one of the main places where kids get sex ed, because the general on-level students are not getting adequate sex education. So they don't get the education for a lot of reasons. But one of them is people think that, oh, well, if we teach them about it, then they'll be sexually active. Well, no, they're human beings. They're probably going to be sexually active, right? They are denied a sense of sexuality or not viewed as a sexual being. So why would they need to know about this? Or people believe, well, what they don't know won't hurt them, right? But actually, denying people information about their bodies and how their bodies work and how to keep themselves healthy and safe is very dangerous. People with disabilities are given very limited options in every single one of their life choices. So they may have limited options in where they live, work, go to school, or do recreational activities. They may have little to no socialization skills or experience, and they may be denied appropriate relationships with other people. So it's really hard to know what's a healthy relationship, or rather what's unhealthy, if you've never had healthy correctly modeled for you. Just as individuals with disabilities have limited options in their life choices, they may have limited communication skills. They may not be verbal. They may be verbal but have a speech impediment that causes them to may not be understood as clearly. They may know ASL, but they don't have an interpreter available. Or they may be targeted by offenders, assuming the abuse will go unreported or undetected because they do not have adequate communication skills. So we've been talking about victims of sexual abuse, but we can't talk about the victims without talking about the abusers. So who are they? 88 to 97% of abusers are known and trusted by the victim. Of that percentage, 32 were family members or acquaintances, and 44% had a relationship with the victim or survivor specifically related to the person's disability. This may be residential care staff, a provider for transportation, a provider for personal care. So that's really alarming, right? And so when you think about if it's way more likely that this person is going to be someone that the victim knows and depends on for care, they're going to be way less likely to report. So that kind of makes sense as to why their statistics for reporting are so low, right? More risk factors are that people with disabilities are frequently considered physically weak, emotionally unstable, intellectually incompetent. They may be viewed by these perpetrators as easy targets for victimization, right? Because the perpetrators may trust that first responders won't believe the victims or know how to help them, or that the victims won't be able to communicate with them. And so unfortunately, people with disabilities are frequently targeted by perpetrators for these reasons. Other things that really feed into the rates of abuse of people with disabilities are the myths that we believe about people with disabilities in general, right? So we believe that they're not sexual beings at all, or that they are overly sexual. We believe that they do not have intimate or romantic relationships, that they are unable to consent to sex at all, that they cannot communicate their thoughts and feelings, that they are not affected by trauma, and that they must have people make decisions for them in all aspects of their lives. We know that all of this is completely untrue, but when you believe all of these myths about a group of people and these stereotypes, it really, really endangers that group of people, because that just makes perpetrators feel like, oh, well, everybody knows, that these people can't do this, that, and the other, and so they're way more likely to be perpetrated against. So we also talk about the deaf population. So deaf is actually not a disability. And when you see us use the term deaf, you'll see it with a big D or a little d or both. So according to the National Association for the Deaf, we use the lowercase deaf when referring to the audiological condition of not hearing. and the uppercase deaf when referring to a particular group of deaf people who share a language, American Sign Language, ASL, and a culture. The members of this group have inherited their sign language, use it as a primary means of communication among themselves, and hold a set of beliefs about themselves and their connection to the larger society. We distinguish them from, for example, those who find themselves losing their hearing because of illness, trauma, or age. Although these people share the condition of not hearing, they do not have access to the knowledge, beliefs, and practices that make up the culture of deaf people. Deaf population statistics. So, 54% of boys who are deaf have been sexually abused versus 10% of boys who are hearing. It's a huge discrepancy. 50% of girls who are deaf have been sexually abused versus 25% of girls who are hearing. 50% of women in the deaf population will experience domestic violence versus 25% of hearing women. And deaf women are less likely to identify IPV, interpersonal violence, as abuse. And that's kind of where we talk about that cultural dynamic. Within deaf culture, it's a very closed community, and so people are nervous to report because maybe if your husband is deaf and he is abusing you and you go to tell someone, oh my gosh, then all these people in the community might find out, or they may not believe me, or they may think, oh, this is somehow my fault. So rates are super high, and then they're also less likely to identify it as violence and then feel like, well, maybe that's just something that men do. This is how men act. So that's sort of an interesting cultural tidbit about violence within the deaf community. So if we're talking about abuse, we have to talk about consent, right? If it's not clear, it's not consent. So a person saying no does not mean that he or she is saying yes. I think we can all agree on that. Silence does not equal consent because silence can mean fear, confusion, all kinds of things. When you really talk about consent, one of my favorite quotes of all time is from Rebecca Goldberg out of a program called New Beginnings in Seattle, Washington. And she says, consent is based on choice. Consent is active, not passive. Consent is possible only when there is equal power. If you can't say no comfortably, then yes has no meaning. And that's one of the biggest takeaways. If you can't say no comfortably, yes has no meaning. Now, people always want to know about, oh my gosh, these people are out there and they're doing this to other people. What's being done? So, like we said earlier, sexual violence is the hardest, most underreported crime and hardest to prosecute. So, let's look at this graphic. So, out of every 100 rapes, of those, 40 get reported to the police. Of that 40, 10 will lead to an arrest. Of that 10, 8 will get prosecuted. Of that 8, only half will lead to a felony conviction. Of that 4, 3 rapists will spend even 1 day in prison. The other 97 will walk free. So when you hear about, oh, well, she cried false assault and he ruined his whole life, that is sort of kind of an urban legend that actually really never happens. As you can see, 97% of people who make a report will never see a day in jail. So, North Carolina specific statistics. So, there were 91 rape crisis centers operating in North Carolina in 2010. And in the 2010-2011 fiscal year, rape crisis centers in North Carolina received 25,058 calls concerning sexual assault. That's approximately 278 calls per program. We can all agree that sexual assault is horrific, but what we don't think about is the long-term residual effects of sexual assault. So victims of sexual assault are 3 times more likely to suffer from depression, 6 times more likely to suffer from PTSD, 13 times more likely to abuse alcohol, 26 times more likely to abuse drugs, and 4 times more likely to contemplate suicide. So the effects of sexual assault are long-ranging, and when you have a group of people, a very large group of people, 1 in 4 women who have experienced this, and their rates of abusing substance use or being depressed is that much higher, what's going to happen? It's going to be hard for them to keep a job. It's going to be hard for them to keep in school. It's going to be hard for them to be good parents. It's going to be hard for them to be good students. So really, this takes a toll on society in general, because what happens is it leads to increased healthcare costs for everyone, because people are, maybe unable to work and having to use government assistance. Sexual assault is not just about the individual. It has a ripple effect, just like everything else. There are more long-term effects, right? So there's the obvious, the STIs or STDs, HIV, unwanted pregnancies, and mental health issues. People with borderline personality disorder often report being sexually abused as children. Depression, anxiety, PTSD, those are very common results of, after experiencing a sexual assault. And dissociative identity disorder. And again, this leads to increased healthcare costs for everyone, right? So if someone is struggling with, they have to be out of work because of this unwanted pregnancy, or they have to be hospitalized because of their depression, and they are poor already, or they become poor because they can't go to work anymore, and you become reliant on these systems that are set up there, of course, to help you. However, this is a very long-term cost for something that shouldn't be even happening in the first place. So we're talking about victims and we're talking about sexual violence. So what do you think a victim of sexual violence would look like? Take a second to think about that. So you kind of have this picture in your head of what you think a victim of sexual violence would look like. Probably like huddled up in a blanket and rocking back and forth and crying, and, Benson from SVU is coming in the hospital room, right? Well, that's not really the case, always, ever. Victims can experience a whole range of reactions because everybody reacts differently to every single situation, whether it's an amazing, wonderful situation or a very traumatizing situation, right? So it's not weird to think that, people may react differently. So some people experience shock and numbness. Some people have intrusive thoughts or flashbacks to the assault. Some people have anxiety and have kind of hypervigilance, like always checking over their shoulder, always checking underneath their car before they get in. Fear, just constant fear. Guilt and self-blame, feeling guilty, thinking, if I just hadn't been there, if I hadn't gone with that person, if I hadn't worn that, if I hadn't drank so much. Anger, angry at themselves for quote-unquote putting themselves in the situation, angry at their perpetrator, angry at God, angry at the police, angry at their whoever, because, you want to place the blame somewhere, and that's hard. And that's a lot of anger to carry around from such a trauma. Isolation, because they may not trust people anymore, so they don't want to be around people. They feel like a downer. They don't trust anybody, so they kind of, hole up in their house. Difficulty with sexual intimacy, even though sexual assault is not about sex at all, it's about power, it was still carried out in a sexual manner, and so that may be a trigger. So that may be resulting in you being unable to, have sex with your partner, or just intimacy in general, just being touched or held or whatever. And then again, it is really important to remember that there's no normal reaction. So just because someone doesn't react how you think you would react or how you have reacted in the past doesn't mean that the trauma didn't happen, and it doesn't mean that the trauma wasn't in fact traumatic. Defining domestic violence. Domestic violence is a pattern of coercive and controlling behaviors that one person uses over another to gain power and control. Domestic violence actually exists on a continuum. Typically it starts off with verbal abuse, putting that person down, mocking them, ridiculing them, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, And then after that kind of settles in, it will result in maybe physical abuse. And then that person apologizes and says, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to hit you, I love you. And they say, okay, but I'll never do it again, okay. And then it starts again, the verbal and the emotional and the psychological, again with the physical. And very often there is the sexual abuse piece in it. Also, very often, women may not define that it is sexual abuse because it's in the constraints of a relationship. But of course, a partner can sexually abuse another partner. So when we're talking about domestic violence, it occurs between current or former partners. It could be parent and child, current or former household members, caretakers, and individuals with disabilities, right? So it's just that domestic piece, within the household, sort of. Former partners are included due to the extremely dangerous time period after a victim of domestic violence leaves their perpetrator. So the most dangerous time for a victim of DV, domestic violence, is not actually while they're living or cohabitating or involved with the partner who's abusive. It's actually after they've made that choice to leave, because that is when most women are killed in situations of domestic violence. With situations of domestic violence, people most commonly think about the physical abuse aspect, right? They think of that woman with the black eyes and the sunglasses and the long sleeves to cover her bruises, and of course that is a piece of it. But not all domestic violence relationships are physically abusive. Physical violence may only be used once or occasionally. Maybe the person only had to hit that person one time for them to say, oh my gosh, well, I'll just be compliant with whatever they say. And the perpetrator knows that. They may just have to threaten physical violence, right? So they may just be able to control them by just giving them a look, or threatening a loved one or a pet even. But, some examples are slapping, punching, strangling, burning. There's a lot of different ways that perpetrators hurt their victims. Arguably, the psychological and emotional abuse is one of the biggest pieces of domestic violence, because the trauma can be caused not just by physical abuse. I mean, victims will say, well, the bruises, and the cuts and the strangulation, that can heal, but those ideas that perpetrator put in that person's head about themselves can be damaging for a lifetime, right? Because the trauma can be caused by just the threats, the acts, the coercive behavior. And, that's sort of like you're belittling, ridiculing, insulting, threatening, being jealousy, monitoring time and whereabouts of partners. But it's always under the guise of like, oh, but I want to protect you, right? So it makes me so jealous when you talk to those other guys. Don't talk to them anymore. And before you know it, this person's isolated from their friends. And oh my gosh, people are crazy in this world, and so I'm nervous when you go to the store. So make sure you're only gone for 30 minutes exactly, otherwise I'll worry. And I need to always know where you are. So every time you cross the threshold of everywhere you go, make sure you call me, right? And so you're constantly monitoring that person. And that person feels like they don't have control over their own lives, right? So that's also a way of really psychologically and emotionally abusing someone, and that has nothing to do with a physical act, right? Then there's the economic abuse. So it could be a couple of different ways. So a lot of times we hear about forcing the partner to be financially and material dependent on the abuser. So, also preventing them from being self-sufficient. So you'll hear an abuser say, well, you don't need to finish school because I'm going to provide for you for everything. And you certainly don't need a job because I make all the money. And not allowing them to be sufficient on their own. Always monitoring the bank accounts, always monitoring credit cards, stuff like this. Or there's also situations where maybe the partner is forced to work and the abuser just stays at home all day and says, well, I'm your husband, you're supposed to take care of me. So we see it both ways. But another thing that abusers will do is maybe interfere with partner's job performance, showing up at your work, yelling at you, and then your boss thinks, oh my gosh, I don't want to hire this crazy person, and fires you. There's a lot of different ways that abusers use money to keep someone there, because if they leave, they feel like, where else am I going to go? I have nothing. Stalking. So there's a ton of different ways that people do this, but that's really just your repeated visual or physical proximity, non-consensual communications, and or written, verbal, or implied threats. So following your partner, standing outside your partner's work or home, leaving unwanted items for the partner to find so that they know, oh my gosh, such and such is always watching, or verbally threatening calls or messages so that this person constantly feels like they're always being watched and controlled by their perpetrator, even if their perpetrator is not even near them. So domestic violence is actually very cyclical. We think about, oh, well, they got into a fight, he hit her, that's domestic violence. And that is definitely a piece of it, but it's actually in three pretty distinct phases. So you have your build-up phase, which is when maybe the perpetrator starts making like little rules that are seemingly benign, but then they get a little bit worse. So for example, I don't like when you go out with your friend Liz, you guys get drunk together and you make bad decisions, so I just really worry about you, and so don't hang out with her anymore. And you're like, well, I don't think we were doing anything that crazy. Okay, well, she's my best friend, so I'm going to hang out with her. So you don't boss me around. So you hang out with your friend again. And he says, well, you're so stupid. I told you not to hang out with her. That was ridiculous. I can't believe you're so dumb to do that. So there's that verbal abuse piece, right? And you're like, okay, well, that's ridiculous. I'm still going to talk to my best friend on the phone, right? At least we can text. And then, I told you not to contact her. And then, there's that explosion, right? That verbal abuse, that physical abuse. And then after the explosion, there's that honeymoon phase, or that sorrow, that I love you so much. I can't believe I did that. I'll never hurt you like that again. You're the only person that's capable of making me this mad. And I'm nothing without you. And if you leave, I'll kill myself. Like, I just love you so much. And then the victim says, well, he seems really sorry, and he's never done like this anything before. And maybe he really does have my best interest involved, right? Because there's all that psychological manipulation happening. And he says, oh my gosh, I'm the only person that can, I must be really important to him if he's going to kill himself over me. Oh my gosh, so I'm going to stay, right? And that itself is very psychologically manipulative, right? So you're going to kill yourself over someone? That's not fair to that person. That's not exactly consensual, right? And then we have it again. And it's a new situation. It's like, well, I told you that I wanted dinner on the table at 6 o'clock. And it's 6:05. And then again, we do this build up and this escalation, and then we have another explosion, and then we're back to the honeymoon phase. And that's why people who are in domestic violence situations are so controlled psychologically and emotionally, and are fearing of their physical safety, that they continue to stay in situations. So that's pretty much a snapshot of what domestic violence looks like. So here's a look at our power and control wheel. So this is a helpful tool that we use in the domestic violence sexual assault field to see patterns of domestic violence and the tactics used by abusers to maintain control over his or her partner. So this is a tool we usually use with people who come in, and it's visual, and so we say like, hey, does any of this look familiar to you? And it talks about the economic abuse, the minimizing, denying and blaming, isolation, intimidation, coercion, threats. So it's a visual tool that's really helpful, and it really spells out for the victim, like, hey, does this look familiar? And then when a victim sees something that's printed out like this, they realize, oh, I'm not alone in this. This is clearly something that's so common that they've created this whole image for it. And there's ones that have pictures. I mean, you can just Google power and control wheels, and they have ones for all different populations. This is just the standard original power and control wheel. So we need to talk about people with disabilities, right? They're an increased risk of victimization, and this is women in particular. So the isolation and dependence that individuals with disabilities experience makes them increasingly vulnerable to physical and sexual abuse. And then their fears of coming forward are even more complicated because let's say that their abuser is a caretaker, which it very likely is. They are terrified that they're going to lose their daily living assistance because what's going to happen to me? Who's going to bathe me, feed me? Housing. How am I going to pay for my house? Who's going to live with me? My independence. Am I going to be put in a group home? if I disclose? Are people going to put me in a mental institution because they think I'm crazy? Or they may just experience more violence by their abuser. So, there are cases where people disclose, and then whoever the party they disclose to goes right back to the abuser and say, such and such told me that this was going on. What is that? And then what does the abuser do? They go back and abuse the person and say, if you tell someone again, I will kill you, or I will kill someone that you love, or even pets or service animals. We see that a lot. Perpetrators threatening pets and other service animals. So individuals with disabilities and domestic violence, we like to talk about intersectionality when we're discussing this. So there are 4 key ways which domestic violence can intersect with a person's disability. So DV can cause temporary or permanent disabilities. For example, there's a higher rate of traumatic brain injury, which is technically not a developmental disability, but presents similarly. And that can cause permanent, or that can be a disability, right? So like, for example, strangulation, that's something that perpetrators use. Hitting victims in the head, that can cause brain damage. The IDD community experiences higher rates of sexual violence and sexual violence and domestic violence. And violence against the disability community often takes on non-traditional forms. So, for example, withholding medications that are necessary for everyday functions, or over-medicating, or breaking equipment that is used to communicate or to help with mobility, or even psychological, like placing someone's medication or someone's walker like just out of their reach. There's a lot of different ways. And then, compounded with all of this, people with disabilities face additional barriers in seeking help. So maybe they have realized, okay, I need to get help, but now how am I going to get to the domestic violence center? I can't drive, and the only person that drives me is my abuser. Or I don't live on a bus line, or I am nonverbal. How am I going to tell what's happening to me? No one's going to be able to help me. So we all know that domestic violence is a really horrific issue in the United States. However, it has reached public health epidemic proportions. Domestic violence is the leading cause of injury to women between the ages of 15 and 44 in the United States. Domestic violence survivors have reported developing disabilities such as loss of hearing or vision. That's often from perpetrators hitting them in the head several times, or strangling them and depriving them of oxygen. Paraplegia, such as someone maybe pushing them down the stairs. Traumatic brain injury, which we discussed previously. Obsessive compulsive disorder. OCD is a very common disorder that is a result of trauma, right? You feel out of control of your situation because someone else is in control of your life. So you resort into anxious behaviors that help you feel like you have better control over your life. And if that's flicking on a light switch however many times you need to, that's kind of what happens. And then exacerbating pre-existing disabilities. So when people are in really traumatic or dangerous situations, their disabilities may be certain things that they have accomplished, well, they'll now regress due to the stress of the abuse or the trauma of the abuser. We talked about barriers, but we know that there's really high rates of violence in the IDD community. But compounded with that, they have really limited access to the services that they need for many, many reasons. So there's the mobility issue, both real and perceived. So they may perceive like, oh gosh, their building probably doesn't accommodate for my wheelchair to wheel through. And even if it does accommodate that, how are they maybe even going to get to the facility because they don't live on a bus line? Or they don't have anyone to drive them. Communication barriers. What if they're like, well, I'm deaf, and who's going to interpret for me when I get to this facility? They may fear that they won't be understood or believed, which is a very real and legitimate fear, because as we know, people with disabilities are way less likely to be believed or perceived as not being as credible. So they know this, right? And that's a very real fear because that's been their truth, up until very recently. They may feel shame and self-blame associated with their disability. So they may feel like, well, if I didn't have this disability, I wouldn't have to rely on this caretaker, and I wouldn't be in this situation, so it's all my disability's fault. They may also feel that they are shameful because, well, if I tell somebody, then I'm outing myself about my disability, and now what if my boss finds out? Social or physical isolation. They may not have anybody to tell to help them get to the services that they need, or have anybody that's going to tell them about the services that are available. And again, fear that others will become aware of their disabilities. So what if someone reveals my HIV status or my mental health disability and that causes me to lose my job, or maybe they're going to put me in a group home or something like that. But most commonly, the fear and the barrier is that the perpetrator is a family member or caretaker. So you're way less likely to report sexual violence or domestic violence, just being a victim in general, then you're way less likely because you have a disability. Then compounded with, it's more likely that the perpetrator is a family member or caretaker, and so now you have to admit that this person who has taken care of you is actually an abuser, and that's really hard. That puts the person in a very conflicting position. So that compounds every single issue that is now facing this person. Characteristics of an abuser. Being an abuser is a choice. Not all abusers are the same, but some share similar characteristics such as low self-esteem, extreme jealousy, substance abuse, mental illness, possessiveness, and controlling personality. This is not to say that every substance user or person with mental illness is an abuser. It just says of those that we have found that are abusers, these are just some common characteristics among all of them. When working with someone and you notice the following things, these can be considered warning signs, and it may not mean anything at all, but it never hurts to check in. So if you have a client that comes in with frequent injuries, and every time you say, hey, what happened there? And it's always like sort of an ambiguous accident. Frequent and sudden absences from school or work. Frequent harassing phone calls from the partner. Fear of the partner. References to the partner's anger. Personality changes. Excessive fear of conflict. Submissive behavior and lack of assertiveness. Isolation from friends and family. Insufficient resources to live, like money, credit cards, car. Depression, crying, or low self-esteem. And this isn't an exhaustive list, and it could be that, something else totally different is going on. But it doesn't hurt to ask, and it doesn't hurt to look into, because you just never know. Another thing that people often say when we're looking into domestic violence situations and noticing if maybe something's going on are the patterns, right? Patterns of trauma. So this person, is July and they're always wearing long sleeves. Maybe that's concealing an injury. Unintentional injuries are not likely to be in patterns, right? So how likely is it this person suddenly dated this person and now all of a sudden they're always tripping over themselves, or always falling down the stairs, or they're always stubbing their toe, or whatever it is, that the excuse that they're giving you. And a lot of injuries that are indicative of abuse are strangulation marks, black eyes, and even bite marks are something to look out for. So let's say you have recognized some patterns or some injuries that you feel are concerning. First you want to build trust with that person. So inform them about confidentiality and including the exceptions to confidentiality. Remain calm. So maybe, this person is telling you something and you want to scream. That's fine. Don't do it then. Wait till you get home or wait till you get to your supervisor's office. Validate their experience. Reassure that the violence is not their fault. Be aware of your reactions and do not minimize their experience. Do not attempt to verify with the abuser or a third party. Do not confront the abuser. Listen to and believe the client. So it's always good to be mindful of safety. So note any suspicious behavior. If you notice that a person's partner or family member or caretaker is always hovering over them, or using restraints to an excess, verbally abusing them, even physically abusing them, ask if the person has any current DVPO, which are domestic violence protection orders, or no contact orders in place. Always ask for safe addresses and phone numbers, even if it's not the client's contact. Don't interfere on the client's behalf. That absolutely puts them at a higher risk for violence. During this time, clients are going to have all kinds of barriers, like the shame and humiliation and self-blame for the abuse. Always that fear that they won't be believed, and fears for their personal safety as well as the safety of their family and friends. We know that abusers will control others by maybe threatening even pets, friends, acquaintances, family members. Previous negative experiences after disclosure. So we know that it is quite possible that someone who has experienced domestic or sexual assault in the past is more likely to experience it again. And maybe the last time they disclosed, nobody believed them and the abuse was ongoing. So maybe they think, well, why should I disclose again? Oftentimes people hope because they think things will change, right? So they were in love with this person. Nobody just falls in love with an abuser, because if they did, if on the first date someone slapped you across the face, there probably wouldn't be a second date. So often with these relationships, there's a happy time and they think, oh gosh, well maybe it'll change and maybe I'll go back to how it was. They could be scared that they may lose the children. They may be worried, oh my gosh, well if I leave him, I don't have a good job. What if DSS awards him custody, which happens, or that they take custody of my children? And then there's also, there's a lot of coping mechanisms that people develop when in situations of trauma. Some healthy and some not so healthy, like substance use. There are more barriers for leaving. Physical, actual barriers like fear of future abuse, death. Perpetrators very commonly say, the only way you're leaving is if I kill you. We know that homicide of women when they are leaving domestic violence perpetrators is very high. And is the most dangerous time in the domestic violence relationship. There is the psychological barrier. What if they're worried like, oh, well, what if I don't get to see the kids? Or what if he starts abusing the kids if I leave? The abuser threatens suicide. If you leave, I'll kill myself. That's a lot to put on someone. That's unfair. That's abusive. They may be dependent on the abuser for drugs or alcohol. If they're substance users themselves and their abuser's a substance user and that's the only way they can afford or have access to their substance, that might be an incentive to stay. Now, children may be at a greater risk during visitation, right? And raising a child as a single parent is a very, really scary thought, especially if you've been in a two-parent system. Or you may be worried that you're going to lose custody altogether. So there's a lot, people always say, well, why doesn't she just leave? If something happened to me, I would just pack up and leave. But you have to think about all the other things. If it was just that easy, then domestic violence probably wouldn't even be an issue. So you have to think about all the different pieces as to why people just don't get up and leave. More barriers for leaving include financial reasons, right? So their standard of living. What if that abuser was the breadwinner, which typically they are, right? Because a lot of times abusers will say, oh, you don't need to work. Just stay home. I'll make all the money. So you're dependent on them. And you're worried, like, oh my gosh, I'm going to go from living in this nice house to a shelter where I'm staying with all these other women who I don't know. Or maybe where they live, there is no access to affordable housing. Or there's no way for them to get a job to afford housing because they don't have the appropriate skills because they quit school because their abuser told them to, or they never got a job to make up, to have savings. They may be worried that the abuser will break their possessions, It's very common. They may lose their job. What if the abuser shows up at your work and causes a scene? A lot of times abusers will threaten family and friends. They'll say, well, if you leave, I'll hurt your best friend, or I'll hurt your mom, or I'll hurt your dad. Loss of support. Like, what if your family and friends aren't really, that in tune with domestic violence, or they've only seen the abuser in a good light. So they might think like, oh, well, here's the thing. She's really dramatic, and he seems like a really nice guy, so I doubt this is what's going on. There's also those religious and cultural beliefs. In a lot of religions, divorce is really not an option, as in, a lot of cultures, it's not really an option. Or conversely, they may not even believe that, that this is actually abuse, given their religious or cultural context. So you really have to be mindful of all the different, parts that people play in society and how that affects their decisions. And then people, these are all barriers for anybody, but then when you compound all these barriers with a disability, they're even further. So you may be dependent on that abuser for things as basic as like just everyday functions. And then they may not be believed, or they may not have any access to services because maybe they don't know about the services, or they're just not existent. So when you're responding to domestic violence, right? So in your intake process, screen to identify current or past violence. So you can ask, have you ever experienced domestic or sexual violence? You can ask even more in-depth questions. If you kind of suspect, we talked about that power and control wheel, that might be something to, kind of slide across the table to your client and say, hey, look at this. Tell me what you think about this. Assess their risk and the needs of the client and their children. And if you determine at that point, like, yeah, this is a dangerous situation and this person is deciding to leave, you can intervene with referrals and assistance. So if that person is ready to leave, a good idea would be to refer them to the local domestic violence shelter. If they are not ready to leave, a good thing to do would be to just inform them of the services. Don't really give them any written information because you just never know if their perpetrator is going through their purse or something like that. But just say, hey, just to let you know, this is something that exists if you ever decide you want to leave or whatever, and then document the abuse in your case files or your database, however y'all do that. How to handle disclosures. Because rates of sexual violence and abuse are high, it is a very real possibility that you may receive a disclosure from someone stating that they, a friend, or a family member is a victim of sexual assault. Here are some general yet very important guidelines that you need to know when handling a disclosure. How should a victim of sexual violence act? There is no one way that a victim of sexual violence behaves. We all have different coping mechanisms, and we all respond to trauma differently. Honestly, we all respond to every single situation differently, whether it's a wonderful situation or a terrible situation, right? So it would make sense that not everyone handles trauma the same way. And just because someone does not act the way a rape victim should, do not disregard their disclosure as attention-seeking behavior, okay? So just because a person doesn't respond in the way that you would or that you have in the past or that you think they should respond, do not just discredit it as, them, oh, they want attention, or this is just a behavior, or this is just something they saw on TV. It does not hurt you at all to take it seriously and explore what's going on. So let's say you are confronted with a person who has been abused and they choose to trust you and disclose to you. So first of all, you want to be an excellent listener. Don't interrupt them or ask too many questions because it may make them feel like they're being interrogated, okay? Right now is their time where they were brave enough to tell their story, and it is an honor that you were the person that they trusted enough to tell to get help. Tell them that you believe them. People rarely make up stories of sexual abuse or rape. The FBI keeps statistics on false reporting of crime, okay? They found that people false report crimes between 2 and 8%. Now, that is the same rate of false reporting of sexual assault. So about at least 90% of sexual assaults are true and not made up. So it's important that you acknowledge and support the victim's disclosure, because the first contact can significantly help or hurt the victim's healing process. Contain your own feelings. This is difficult, especially if you have an emotional connection with the person. Try to remain professional. Emotional reactions can make the victim feel guilty for disclosing or cause more feelings of shame, right? And we typically want to make people feel better, not worse. Acknowledge their trust in disclosing to you. Highlight their strength and courage in taking action in their healing process. Tell them, thank you so much, and this was so brave of you for coming forward. This was a big deal. Thank you so much. And offer them the appropriate referrals for professional support. Give them information with their local RCC, Rape Crisis Center, or Domestic Violence Center, or whoever you see fit. And be familiar with your organization's policies regarding disclosure of abuse. And if your organization does not have a policy in place, Rape Crisis Center would be happy to assist you to help develop one. So do not ever, even if you don't believe the person, even if honestly you feel like it somehow is their fault or whatever, it's just not necessary for you to provide your opinion or your input. All you have to do is believe them or fake it. So do tell them that they are not responsible for what happened and it is not their fault. Do make necessary referrals, such as Department of Social Services and RCC. And do consult your RCC staff members, which are available 24/7, whether you need to process something or you have further questions. Something really important is don't make promises you can't keep, especially if they ask you to keep their disclosure a secret. You can tell them, well, what you say here stays here, but that may not always be the truth. Don't give the impression that you might believe the victim is somehow at fault. So don't ask, wait, how much did you have to drink? Or, why did you go over to their house? Or, this happened 2 months ago, why didn't you tell me sooner? Right? It doesn't matter. It's totally irrelevant. All we need to focus on right now is this is the situation at hand and how we're going to best handle this. And don't ask intrusive questions. That's up to, if the victim decides to report, that's up to law enforcement. That's not your job. Making a report. So let's say you have reason to believe someone is being abused or neglected, so you decide to pick up the phone and call social services. So what must be included in the report? That's really any information that you have, but ideally it would include the name, address, and age of the individual who you're reporting about, and then the name and address of the caretaker or the abuser, the nature and extent of the injury, abuse, neglect, or exploitation, and then other pertinent information. However, if you don't have all of this information, that is not a problem. Just give as much as you have. Reporting can also be done anonymously, but professionals should not report anonymously. Either way, whether you report anonymously or you give your name, DSS does not share the information about the reporter to the perpetrator or the victim. A letter will be sent to the reporter stating how DSS will proceed with the report. So you make the report, they'll ask for your address and stuff, then within however long you'll get a letter from DSS saying, "Dear such and such, we have either chosen to screen this in or screen it out," and they'll let you know what's going on. This concludes the Safety and Security Initiative training. We hope you gathered the following key points. First of all, that people with disabilities are more at risk for abuse. Everyone is a mandated reporter by North Carolina law. And believe all victims, regardless of what you may think. We thank you so much for joining us.